Hi, Sharon. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Justin?
I'm great. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started here. Um, this is You, Me, and IP. Today we're going to be talking about space marks. Really going to talk about intellectual property in space. Um, and just to introduce ourselves. So I'm Justin McNaughton, and Sharon Urias is joining me. I typically protect intellectual property by filing applications, registrations, that sort of thing. And Sharon loves to fight about intellectual property. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Today we're talking about space, we're talking about intellectual property, the final frontier, all of the interesting things that go along with that. It is a little odd because intellectual property is so important to space exploration. And yet, when it comes down to it, we're out there exploring, but that's not really a good place to be protecting IP. And so how do we deal with that? So Sharon, you want to get us started on kind of an overview of this?
Yeah. So intellectual property is essential to, the exploration in outer space. It's also essential to commercialization. It sort of underpins everything. Without the technological advances, advancements and developments that we have, obviously there'd be nothing that we would be doing in outer space. And multiple countries are engaged in space travel. They're developing plans for long-term human habitation, in addition to continued exploration. And up until recently, it has been all, at least in the United States, and I'm assuming in other countries as well, publicly funded governmental programs that have driven the space programs. Now you've got private companies. You've got Virgin Galactic, you've got Blue Origin, you've got SpaceX. And those companies now are starting to develop their own intellectual property, their patents, trade secrets, trademarks. And there are talks about setting up a legal structure to address these intellectual property issues that are facing companies and governments in outer space. And again, particularly because of the shift in space development from the public sector to the private sector, and from pure exploration to commercialization, which includes talks of, tourism in outer space, which sounds crazy. Maybe in 50 years from now, it'll seem totally normal and routine. But for now, the current legal landscape does not address these advancements, and it's always the case, Justin, this, that the law always has to have time to catch up with technology. And IP, for the most part, I would say it's not really protected in outer space. And I know you're going to talk about some of the treaties that address some of these issues, but the reality is that space is part of international law. And so whereas each country has its own intellectual property law regime, the existing space treaties, although they address tangible property like spaceships and satellites, they don't address things like trademarks. We were talking about this earlier. I don't even know really if they address torts in outer space. I mean, if someone can't really slip and fall because they're floating around, in zero G, but there are some treaties that deal with liability issues, just not trademarks. So what is the current landscape?
So let's first talk about what it is we're really looking at for space. So space right now is, we think of space as, this kind of almost incomprehensible area. But really, when we're talking about space, what we're talking about is a line that's kind of arbitrarily set about 100 kilometers above sea level, roughly, in line with the atmosphere. And then from there, you go up to about 2,000 kilometers above sea level. And you have this donut that goes around the Earth. Well, it wouldn't really be a donut because, it'd be very difficult to make donut. That goes around the Earth. And it's that band is what we're talking about is low Earth orbit, then the occasional trip to the moon, and then, right now unmanned trips to Mars, but eventually,
Unpersoned trips.
And what's that?
I said unpersoned.
Yeah, unpersoned trips. I apologize. Yes, yes. And so we've got a bunch of treaties. The first one, and I'm gonna have to like take a deep breath here and try to read this. The first one is the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies. So, yeah, terrible for acronyms. Usually, you know, these have pretty catchy acronyms. I'm not seeing it there. But not surprisingly, this one did not have much to do with trademarks, not much to do with intellectual property.
1967. So that was before
1967.
US even landed on the moon.
Yeah, 2 years before, I think at this point, they were mostly worried about people not parking weapons of mass destruction on the moon. You know, but it does say that, hey, outer space, nobody can, you know, appropriate national space through some claim of sovereignty. So, so that flag on the US flag on the moon was purely PR. So then we move forward. 1998, things do get a little interesting. Here we have the Intergovernmental Agreement on Space Station Cooperation. So this is for the ISS. And that was signed in 1998. And it does have an article on it dealing with patents and dealing with trade secrets. And it was signed by, I think at this point, it's 15 different countries. And it is interesting. I mean, this one, basically it requires everybody who's involved, right? Because the ISS has all sorts of different things from different countries up there. And it basically requires everybody to mark their own stuff. So I'm in my head, I'm imagining it like a college dorm, right? The ISS is just a college dorm. Which is mark their stuff.
Right? You go to summer camp or a dorm, you mark stuff so no one's stealing.
It's like, yeah, it's summer camp. It's like the ISS is like going to some glorified summer camp. I'm sure that I've offended an astronaut. Wasn't my intention there. But while you're up there, you know, another one would be, it's kind of like the embassy, right? So they treat these sections of the ISS as basically extensions of the country that made them. That's kind of the idea. But
like a little mini UN in space almost.
Yeah. So, but that treaty doesn't deal with trademarks or copyrights. It doesn't deal with dispute resolution either, which I think is interesting. What it does do is it says, hey, if you're in, so for example, I think Japan has a high-tech lab that they outfitted on the ISS. And so anything that's developed in that lab would defer to Japanese law, or anything that's built in the US section defers to US law. So that's why, you know, so I'm, you know, not true, but I'm imagining Scotch tape down the line, you know, like, oh, hey, if you cross over this, just know. Then, so the US.
But what happens if a theft of a trade secret occurs in neutral territory, whether it's, you know, let's just say during a spacewalk, or I'm sure there are parts of the International Space Station that are not country specific. I mean, that we're getting into sort of, you know, law school level hypotheticals, but it is interesting to contemplate these kinds of scenarios because they could happen.
Right. And so what we have there, so there's actually a US statute that, so what we just talked about was for the ISS. So there's an agreement. So it's a treaty that deals with, you know, everybody playing nice on the space station. Then you have a treaty or a US statute, 35 USC 105, that basically says that any inventions that are made, used, or sold in outer space on a US space object will be considered as though they were made, sold, or, you know, in the US. So I imagine if you're out there, you're probably inside a US made spacesuit or whatever country. And if other countries have the same kind of statutes, it's going to like impute back to US law that way. So kind of clever, you know, trying to make it work, that sort of thing.
And it's sort of based on US, it's based on maritime law, isn't it?
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of these are, the concepts apply to when you're out in international waters with a boat, same kind of context that people can't own the oceans, they're available for exploration, that sort of thing.
So why can't they just use those existing laws and expand them to apply to outer space?
Where would be the fun in that? You know, where would be the fun in that? We have a chance to come up with something totally different. I have no idea.
I don't either. Or, if a little green person comes down and infringes on your intellectual property, then I don't know what to tell you.
Nice.
I mean, so really, I sort of joke, but why do we even care about this? I know
this was your idea for the webinar.
It was my idea for the webinar. I think it's an interesting topic. I mean, I think one obvious reason to care about it is, as we were saying, some of the most sophisticated, and technological developments in the history of humankind are up there right now in outer space, being used. And so as things expand to the private sector, in order to encourage creativity and development and inventiveness, which is what the IP laws in the United States are intended to do, we need to do that with respect to outer space. So there need to be laws dealing with the manufacturing, the use, the licensing, especially, if you think about it. So we were talking, I mentioned earlier, SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic. Those three companies all have something really interesting in common besides being, private companies for space travel. Do you know what they are, Justin?
I'm actually sitting here going, I wonder where she's going with this.
She's going with this. Well, they're all funded by billionaires or trillionaires or zillionaires, right? You've got Jeff Bezos, you've got Elon Musk, and you've got Sir Richard Branson. And I'm not picking on those guys at all. What I'm saying is that if you want to encourage the same sort of creativity and inventiveness and development by, everybody else, there needs to be something that will assure those people that their inventions and whatnot will be protected and that they can license them. There's a huge market for that. There's also a lack of certainty and uniformity. And as you said, there's no enforcement mechanism. Each company has its own IP laws. So, maybe if you had a Chinese company that launched a satellite that said SpaceX on the side, SpaceX could file a lawsuit against that company in China.
Right. And so it tends to be tied to the place of origin, like where, not meaning in a trademark sense, but tied to truly like where it was manufactured and sent to space. And which, so there are a couple things that people can do, because I think we're entering, like you said, this next era. This current era is, billionaires and governments in space exploration. The next one is going to be smaller companies sending things on these spaceships, whether it's for research, whether it's for, and this already happens in the ISS, but those types of things are controllable but through agreements. So you can agree with, if you're going to use Blue Origin, right? You can have an agreement with Blue Origin that sets out where you're going to fight about things, who owns what, that sort of thing, and that'll control in most places. So that's, I think, how a lot of this will be dealt with.
With sponsorship opportunities too.
Right. Like, so if somebody wants to
ride and he wants to, wear some branded shirt to fund it.
Yeah, right. And hopefully he gets, in the case of NASA, hopefully they get permission from that. I don't know that NASA's like quite ready to embrace full endorsements all over the
celebrity endorsements on the side of the space capsules. Probably not. But
right. So
it's crazy, but it's really not that far off.
No, it's not, and you'll see this happening, right? Because people will. It's the cachet that comes with this. It will happen, right? There are going to be, but a lot of that can be dealt with private agreements. Then you have, another strategy might be, to date, there's a lot of infrastructure that's required to actually launch a rocket. So another option might be to look around. If you do have, it might be, you might be able to afford to protect just in those countries where it's likely that somebody would launch, right? So US, China, maybe Russia. And the concept being that, well, okay, if you're trying to avoid, like you've got this piece of technology and you're trying to protect against somebody else copying it, developing it in another country, launching it into outer space, and then never touching, say, the US where you have your patent, then a way to look at it would be similar to a strategy used for manufacturing, where you look at those countries where somebody might launch and protect in those countries, so at least you have a remedy at the place where it leaves. So
About the use in commerce requirement.
so switching back to trademarks,
Yeah.
yeah, trademarks I still think we're a long way off, because I don't see people, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see there being commerce that's not tied to a particular country for a long time. So I think you're covered through your registrations in those particular countries.
I don't know, because if, for example, in the US, one of the requirements is that you use it in commerce, and that means commerce in the United States. I can't rely on someone infringing on my mark in Japan to sue in the US, right? So if somebody, like I was saying, launches a satellite with my mark on the side, or their astronauts or cosmonauts or whatever they're called have, my logo on them, and it generates a lot of publicity, then how am I going to be protected? That's
right. And that's where, but you would probably be able to register your trademark in those countries where there are launch sites, and stop it that way. But but that would be the same as identifying some of these countries, these big countries where you'd want to stop somebody from using your mark anyway and trying to go and lock
But
it up.
it just doesn't give a lot of assurance to the IP rights holder. And, one thing that I was thinking is, if you have an organization like the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, think about, the internet. The internet in some ways was like outer space, especially when no one knew what the heck it was. And you had all these domain name issues start to arise. And the question was, where on earth could you sue someone for using a domain? How could you recover domain if somebody registered it in, a far off place? And so WIPO came up with a whole, regulatory scheme to deal with that. And maybe that's the governing body that should come up with a uniform scheme to protect not just these larger countries and parties, but also the IP rights holders and the developing companies, so they can benefit from their invention.
Right, and I like that, because what you're describing are the same issues that you'd have where a lot of times somebody registers a domain, you have no idea where they're at. And so it gives you a process that you can resolve the issue, even if you can't find the person.
That's right.
At some point we'll get there for things in outer space, but it does, now would be a good time to do the framework so that there is this body set up. And then when, we have the same issues with where, at some point people will be able to launch something from anywhere,
Right.
And figuring out how to stop that. So, and I see that coming up first in the patents and trade secrets. Still,
Right. Right, because I like what you had suggested, that you can go, if you have the money and the ability to register in different countries. It's not that way with trade secrets. You don't register anything, right? So
right.
You got to figure out where you're going to sue, what law applies. It's fairly complicated.
Yeah. Well, part of me thinks that maybe we just leave all this to our future robot overlords to sort out. So, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean,
Can we see if we've got any questions?
Yeah, it looks like we do have a question.
And then we'll take a few questions and then we'll kind of wrap it up.
So the first question is, how are inventions on the space station handled? Justin, you want to take that one?
Yeah. So this is actually kind of an interesting one, but this goes back to, now if it's on the question's on the space station, right?
Yes.
Okay, so on the space station, you've got the agreement that deals with the ISS. So you have a treaty in place for all the countries participating. And so my understanding that it works is if it's invented and you're in the US section of the space station, then you'd be subject to US law and it would go through. If it had to be something that was developed in the Japanese lab, then it may be Japanese law that governs. Now, the thing that sounds a little weird, but then underneath it all, it might not matter because the US and Japan already have a patent treaty. And so under the patent treaty, regardless of where it was developed, you can patent it in both countries, and there's a process for doing that. So, you don't have to be in the US to take advantage of US patent laws. You can file a patent in the US, even if something was invented outside the US and or by somebody who's not a citizen of the US. So in some respects, it's a cool, interesting question. And in other respects, it's not going to actually, be determinative of the outcome because these
how many countries
treaties.
Justin, like, do all of the countries in the International Space Station have patent treaties like you're talking about?
There are only, what do we say? I think we said there were like 15 countries that are part of the ISS treaty.
Yeah.
I mean, I would be very surprised if those 15 countries are not part of the patent cooperation treaty. So chances are they are already standardized for these things. So
the patent side is pretty much covered. Trade secrets, to the extent that if a trade secret is stolen from the US sector, US law would apply the, Defend Against Trade Secrets Act.
The trade secrets. So that's a good question. Like, because trade secrets are more difficult because, let's back up, because the way that you really protect a trade secret is not to tell anybody.
Right.
So there are a lot of things.
First, you have to prove you have a trade secret.
Right. But the way you protect it is just make sure nobody else has it. So in the context of like the ISS, the way you'd have a trade secret, that if you were not part of it, would be a company that had some research they needed to have done. They did an agreement to have that research done on the space station, which we aren't going to get into all of the perils and difficulties of doing deals with the US government. But let's say you get past all that, you have your research being done in that lab. Until you publish it, that research is potentially trade secret. And so but you have people up there from all different countries, right, that may have access to it. And so you're right, that's a difficult thing, because once that's out, the value of the trade secret's gone, even if it was out, even if somebody made a mistake or intentionally sabotaged it. Like, the real value is keeping it secret. How do you do that?
What are reasonable steps to keep a trade secret confidential on an International Space Station?
And it's going to be, so I was just reading the paper. There's a new company called Space Ride, and I think it's out of Ontario. And unlike the prior ones, these folks, I don't know that much about it, but they have some new technology, and part of which is that it decreases the cost to get up by a lot because they're not using normal rocket boosters, that kind of stuff. But their whole right now, their whole focus is on these tourist travel, tourist trips,
right,
go to space, and but they're super secret because they're doing this a different way than anybody else. And so I imagine that, in addition to writing them your check for $250,000, you're going to also sign a confidentiality agreement, right? And maybe they'll jettison you halfway if you breach. So.
That's a way to A, make sure your trade secrets stay protected, but B, never recover a dime.
But they will come up, because you're gonna, in financing these, you're gonna have to find ways where you're gonna have, passengers on tourists alongside scientific research, right? You're going to be doing both in the same sphere. And so you're going to have the people who are tourists either not aware of or signing confidentiality agreements. And,
But
and
Justin, even having them sign a confidentiality agreement, if they don't need to know it, I mean, arguably, you're not
yeah,
really taking the measures.
right. Like if you can do the experiment or the tests in a way that the tourists don't know, then you do that. Otherwise, you're going to have to get an agreement from them, and then we go back to, and it'll have a choice of law provision that is probably not going to be favorable to the tourist. So.
Well, and you know, one interesting thing when we're talking about the license agreements is right now, it's pretty standard language in a trademark license agreement to say something like, I'm licensing or as an assignment, assigning perpetual worldwide rights. Does worldwide include, is that universe wide or just US wide?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's just a difference in so a lot of patent and trademark agreements kind of deal with that. Copyright has been saying, throughout the universe for a long time, and I don't know why that is. I think it's probably because it was easier to be playing music into deep space.
Broadcasting, right? You're playing.
Yeah, so then everybody freaked out 20, 30 years ago, and they've been putting, throughout the universe and copyright contracts, but yeah, so patents, patent licenses will start moving that way as well, to the extent they haven't.
Right, unless you redefine worldwide to not just include Earth.
That's a pretty Earth-centric view of the universe.
It really is. I'm sorry. I guess I am Earth-centric.
So, well, it's always fun to talk to you.
Likewise, and I like your ultimate suggestion, which is we just leave it to the future robot overlords. So
right, which will probably be owned by the same companies anyway.
All right.
Talk to you soon.
If you have any questions, please feel free to email Justin or me anytime. Thank you for attending, and we'll see you next month.